So, I want to talk a little bit about the emergence of baseball as really what amounts to a purely aesthetic phenomenon. And it's fascinating specifically because baseball is dressed up in clothes, and this is really what culture is. It's clothes for the biological, which is really a cosmological, as in psychological, evolution of the organism in terms of a coming into consciousness. And this returns us to the aspect and element of radical play, which I think has been at the forefront of this entire project, which is to say an interlocution and interjection into the foundations of being as it is manifest in history and time. And we've talked about nature itself as a culture, and there's a fantastic duality of the term culture and the idea of a bacterial culture or a cellular culture, or even an ecosystemic culture, which is the sort of rules of operation which are inherent and apparent behind the phenomenological manifestation of the system operation of the organism or the ecosystem, as in a jungle or a terrarium or a cosmological solar system, even an atomic order, right, or a molecular cellular order. And this is what culture is. It's the organizing operating system of any given sphere of influence. So we can think of baseball as a cultural sphere of influence as it pertains to the Western Hemisphere, which radically expands into the Eastern Hemisphere, particularly with the tours of Japan conducted by Babe Ruth and his teams of All-Stars. So what I want to talk about here is the clothes that baseball wears, and this is obviously the same as the clothes of Marx's 18th Brumaire, in the sense that he says history occurs once as tragedy, second as farce, and it returns wearing the same clothes. He's talking about this in terms of military uniforms and empires and emperors, but here, really, what I'm talking about is the aesthetic clothes of play, which are native to baseball, which is itself the athletic garment. And so the image I'm giving you here of the 1897 Boston Bean Eaters, this cabinet photograph, is of an organism wearing the cultural clothing, which is atop, as in a technology, right, a scaffolding or a prosthetic or a systems process which is building on top of the fundamental biological, metabolic, cellular, chemical, and elemental clothing of the human being as itself a star system nesting doll, thermonuclear thermodynamic nesting doll effect. And when we look at baseball as a radical political and cultural device, we're looking about a movement into play in terms of an organizing ethical force and moral construct within history and within civilization. And the entire reason for civilization, to me, is summed up in the entity of baseball, which is the cultivation of the ability to play consciously, as in the rule systems which govern baseball, the practice of adhering to those rule systems, and acculturating oneself to a community of others, as in a network of mutual responsibility, as a ecosystemic symbiosis, which is native to spheres of biotic interrelationship which excel, which is to say that the biome itself is mutually self-supporting with all of the entities therein. We're talking here about systems processes, and this is where it gets very granular, because any system process must be contributive to the success of the whole, which is to say any organism within that process, any cellular movement within that process, any neural movement, any bacterial or organ movement must be in symbiotic synthesis to perform an advanced practice of the whole being itself. And this is something that is native to the left brain, right brain relationship in instances of profound genius where intuition intersects with the rational which is to say the analytical and the logical. This is well researched in terms of neuroscience. So we're talking about the being coming into unity with itself through cultural theater, which is the advent of baseball. And this is what's so interesting in terms of the Beaux Arts aesthetic depiction of the Boston Baseball Club here by Chickering, the well-renowned, highly professional, high arts and high society aesthetic photographer. Here we go. Yeah, Elmer Chickering. So what we're talking about here is this realization, especially at the turn of the century, which is a turn of the epoch of Oscar Wilde. It's a turn from the Victorian into the modern. And this is the time of the Beaux Arts movements. This is a time of a strange transformation which is occurring in the technological mind of the human being as it pertains to the revelation of that which it is through industrial technology, particularly the photograph, as well as the factory, and the expansion of the mind through a larger ecosystemic awareness in terms of a global interrelationship, which is really the period in American civilization and American history between the Civil War and World War I, which is to say an increasingly incorporative, integrative, and integral awareness of that which is in terms of a larger sense and concept of humanity and human culture, where the human being and the organism is being radically delocalized and situated within a larger process of knowledge and information, which is necessarily not immediately and directly absorbed by the sensate body and must necessarily be conceptualized, abstractly ritualized in terms of a framework of consciousness, where the being itself, in terms of a subjectivity, right, the grounded organism with its neural processes, its organs, and its senses, is being systematically, by way of this churn of modern industrial society and global consciousness, lifted out of its local network, its local organizing framework, as in a rural, agrarian, pre-modern consciousness, and being transmuted and lifted into a global consciousness in which the human being becomes an abstract device and mechanism. There's a split consciousness that occurs here, which is itself why you will hear modernity referred to in critical circles as a form of schizophrenia, and it's a schizophrenic device, because what it does is it separates the subject from its ontology, which is to say the body, and radically delocalizes it into a larger network of interrelated systems, organisms, and processes of which it necessarily must conceptualize. So the human being now in modernity lives in a conceptual reality of archetypes, architecture, and metaphor, to attempt to construct and understand its world as it's been thrown into by way of information networks and information systems, and as the 20th century turns, information technologies, which situate the organism into a larger cosmology than it can adequately conceptualize in the physical body and perceive in the physical world. So this is a radical rupture elucidated architectonically by quantum mechanics. Elucidated again phenomenologically in World War I and World War II, but beyond that, aesthetically in the arts movements of Cubism, Surrealism, and even Dadaism, in terms of a destruction and death of the system of values which formerly governed the agrarian, localized human tribal consciousness, which is broken through the technological device and aperture, the prosthetic of modernity. And so this is the turn that you witness at the turn of the 1900s. And what I mean by this is that this is a hinge at which the human being is actively achieving hyperspace. It is reflecting upon itself no longer with the garments of the survivalism of war, but with the garments of the aesthetic play of baseball as a collective unity, which is to say, a aestheticized community, which is the baseball team. This is an arbitrary community of individuals who are at work together to achieve a common goal, which is a nonsense goal. It's loosely tied to survival in terms of the salaries that these players achieve, yes, but it's a common goal to achieve, in the case of the Bean Eaters, the National League Championship over the Baltimore Orioles. This is entirely an aesthetic realm. This is entirely theatrical realm, which is divorced from the everyday concerns of the organism, as in the realities of nature, the biological realities of nature, and it has been inserted into an aesthetic cultural dialogue, which is equivocal and equivalent to mythology in history and mythology in time. Everything from the creation of the baseball stadium to the aesthetic practice of baseball and the theatrical uniforms worn in the aesthetic practice of baseball create in an ulterior aesthetic dimension the possibilities of the evolution of human consciousness by achieving hyperspace through the utilization of the human being biome and biology. To achieve an aesthetic goal, wearing aesthetic clothes in an aesthetic realm, which is an entire ulteriority, it's effectively a dream state of consciousness. And it's no coincidence that this formation of the cultural identity of baseball as it lurches into the 20th century is occurring alongside leading edge thinkers like Charles Baudelaire or Edgar Allan Poe or Nietzsche or, as we discussed, Oscar Wilde, because these are all dialogues that are reflecting upon and back into, particularly with Edgar Allan Poe in terms of the dream, or Oscar Wilde in terms of the picture of Dorian Gray, or Nietzsche discussing the death of God and the radical transvaluation of values of the human being, man being a tightrope between beast and God. And Baudelaire himself with The Flowers of Evil. They are reaching into the aesthetic mythic dimension in an age where the aesthetic mythic dimension is being systematically dislocated and deregionalized and deconstructed, which inevitably culminates 50 years later with the philosophical existentialism, literary and visual arts existentialism of the mid-20th century. This is a delocation of the former mythic consciousness, which is systematized culturally in a series of creation myths in a world historical sense. But and this delocation of these regional tribal myths is being there is a psychological scramble at a collective systemic level, which is symbolized in World War I and World War II, to relocate the ground of truth in a world in which it has expanded. There's been a quantum expansion in the philosophical and psychological aperture of the human being due to industrial technology, which is the increase of globalization by the compression of space-time through cars, planes, the light bulb into information technology such as computing and then quantum computing and artificial intelligence. This is a decompression of space-time, an opening up of the aperture of the vessel of consciousness, which is radically, again, relocating, delocating, and almost, again, in the schizophrenic sense of modernity, dislocating the human being conscious experience from the aperture of the physical body into a hyperspace of the necessary perception of a greater, grander, more complete, and thus more abstract in the sense of being delocated from the subject body, which is the sensate body, into this aperture which now expands the conflict between self and world, the vision of self and world, as in a radically complex revelation that's occurring within the human being's psyche of this greater, grander, more totalizing, and increasingly more clear and coherent series of interconnected nodes which compose the entire space-time architecture of existence itself. And this is a forced process which is hyper-accelerated by modernity and industrial modernity. If you can understand this, because this is not just theoretical, this is not just abstract, this is a real experience of consciousness expansion. Due to the technologies which ritualize this into the everyday, this affects everyone from the butcher to the baseball player to the physicist. Because the architecture of the real is being blown apart by devices which are breaking the ritualized agrarian notions of space-time. And you can understand this most clearly in terms of the light bulb. The invention of the light bulb changes time. There's no longer a reliance on the space-time mechanism of the sun as a gravitational field. Ritualized in miniature, the appearance of the sun, which then is advanced exponentially in the invention of the atom bomb. This is a increasing sophistication of the ritualization in miniature of the foundational rules and regulations of space-time, which is a breaking into the code of existence, which is the formerly agrarian mode of consciousness. And in the same way, with baseball as a cultural technology, you have a grounding of the historical, philosophical metaphysics which undergird human societies and communities into history and into time as an active mythologization, which emerges these modern industrial heroic figures, such as Lou Gehrig or Ty Cobb or Honus Wagner, who are products of this industrial modernity and performing the heroic function as in a steel Hercules of the psychological architecture of cultural and civilizational modernity in American history. And this is what is so fascinating about the close of baseball, how it is so thoroughly an ulterior aesthetic realm, because when we're looking at the sophistication of a civilization, all civilizations implicitly and even explicitly in their values that they express are seeking to destroy themselves to create a greater, higher mode of being. And this is why when I say the human being is actively seeking to achieve escape velocity from itself, the human being is looking to break free from the human being, as in the locus of consciousness which resides in a critical aperture within the human being, governed by metabolism, entropy, gravity, the field of the body as a genetic architecture in deep space and deep time, actively looking to achieve through the grand psychological metabolic device of culture a hyperspace in which true liberation of the principle of being can be achieved. Because this is the fundamental underlying state and condition and essence of being itself, grounded as in a synaptic architecture and a linguistic genome and genetics within this specific form, which is seeking revelation as in liberation of that which it is itself. And this is the purpose and true orientation of culture in all culture, from Picasso to the Boston Beaneaters of 1897. Baseball itself as a critical aperture grounded in the everyday historical material experience of the human being, a ritual theater in which the human being can ascend and transcend through this hypermaterial perceptive lens, which is the phenomenological grounding of the everyday, the human being, the birth and the death of the organism, and ritually reveal and achieve the total fullness of being by way of this entire devotion of the human being toward the aesthetic practice, which is the attempt to achieve the revelation of being in time. And this is why theater is so essential, and why Camus says his two great loves in life were the theater and football. He's talking about European football. These are two modes which are inseparable. They are the same thing. They are cultural theater, which is a aesthetic distance of the human being from itself in which it can ritually realize the full powers of its native existence, which are normally and formally devoted to food, water, shelter, reproduction, and survival. The devotion of that by creating an ulterior aesthetic realm, which is a theatrical realm of caricature, to emerge the mythic potentialities and possibilities, all of which in the historical, ancient historical mythological sense, are the emergence of the gods, so to speak, from within the human being and as the human being, which are the localized energetic forces incarnate in the human being experience that are latent within the biological, chemical, hormonal, and elemental drives of the human being, to emerge those fully, which are the fundamental, essential, potential aesthetic qualities, which require this cultural realm or cultural theater as a sort of grand permission to emerge. And this is why culture itself is a aesthetic environment, as you can see with the Beaux Arts almost tapestry in the background of the Gothic arches. This is a suspension. It's a ritualized suspension of the everyday. It's a suspension of time in order to reveal. So the human being itself, in terms of the everyday, as described most succinctly by the poet Mayakovsky, there's this profound, creative, existential urge, which I would really just describe as the human condition, as elucidated in existentialism, most clearly by those who are the profoundly articulate, which is to say the philosophers. They're articulate of the human condition, the experience of being human. Not a symbolic representation of the experience of being human, the experience of being human. That the experience of being human is always already seeking to transcend itself as in the realization and revelation of that which it is. But the difficulty is, what is the method, which is to say the linguistic architecture, to assimilate and reproduce and experience that? Which is to say that which one is at the most latent foundational form of the drive itself. Which is to say the most elemental will. The character of the will, to emerge the character of the will. And this is the genius of a philosophical and cultural architecture of play, which is being built architectonically, subterraneanly, in this fomenting consciousness, which is the emergence of modern American civilization, which is in and as its emergence as the creation of its national pastime, which is to say its way of being, which is in its most authentic self a leisure practice. It is creating in real time this architecture from the mud and wood beams of its own primordial subconscious, its own uterine infancy. It's creating this aesthetic ulterior mode, which we emerge and we see as baseball as the mass ritual cultural practice of today. This is being constructed not by one mind's mythic framework, as in an archetypal and alchemical descent of someone like Carl Jung in the Red Book. This is being created as a collective, cultural, systemic ritual practice of agreed upon systems, laws, rules, regulations, and events, architectures of leagues, structures of championships, aesthetic representations in terms of high art and high politics and high culture cabinet photographs, which ritually represent this emerging political subconsciousness. Becoming conscious, becoming part of the ritual architecture of American civilization and American history itself. This is what modernity is and means. Specifically as it pertains to American civilization, which is becoming conscious of itself in terms of a real birth into, from a primordial pre-adolescence into an early adulthood, which is to say the emergence of a self-consciousness from this womb-like suspension in the terrain of attempting to discern what its identity is practically
upon the theoretical constructs which undergird it, which is to say the Constitution and the essential missive or the drive forth into birth of the civilization, which is attempting to create the philosophical exoskeleton upon which the flesh of the being of American civilization can be purchased. This is a profound and fundamental intersection of the birth of modernity and the birth of American civilization as a conscious entity, which is intersecting directly at and with the subconscious mud and wood sculptural artifact and artifice of American baseball history, as it is attempting to quantize and qualify its psychological architecture at a group collective level through the cultural artifact. And this is what's so important, is that the artifice itself is attempting to metabolize this psychological tension, first of the emerging birth of civilization, and second of the emerging birth of modernity from the ashes of an agrarian local consciousness. And this is the high strangeness behind baseball, which is the capturing of these images which are radically dislocated from the human experience. They're not human. They're an aesthetic artifact of an alien consciousness which is emerging from the basement of the human archetype, which is genetic, biological, chemical, and elemental. It's a conference and a confluence of possibilities, which is not it's achieving a hyperspace of consciousness. It's a consciousness that is radically relocalizing itself in an entirely new terrain of values and laws and reason from the human being architecture. It's devoting itself to something entirely new and different through this subcultural architectonic basement of the grand attempt in a human and even cosmological sense to achieve the hyperspace of consciousness and being itself. The ritual revelation of being out from under the historical sediment of the genetic and cosmological, phenomenological, planetary, interstellar reality. From these local systems, which have profound histories and thus have profound densities. It's a radical liberation project, and it's an escape project of the abolition of the human to achieve that which is the truly human out from under and beneath the human. And what's required is this disguise or this costume, this way of creating the ulterior mode, which is to say, stepping outside of the ritual every day. And this is the function of war in a profound sense, if you understand this, but this is why war always fails. Because war is still always already about survival and material, the human body and the human organism, and the drives which underlie the human organism. It's just an intensification of those drives. But what baseball is a radical delocation from those drives to reveal the energetic principles as in the character and fundamental essence and nature of the will out from beneath them, which is pre-phenomenological, pre-cosmological, into the quantum architecture of the character of being itself, which is the child at play with colored balls. It's not a return in so much as it is a realization of the fundamental principles of that which is prelapsarian in a human being sense, because you can think of this in an individual architectural sense in terms of the psychology and psychological development of the human being. The human being is first allied only to play, a play which is almost entirely divorced of body consciousness, because the consciousness itself is not localized or grounded within any firm architecture. The experience of being human is outside of the body. It's not that the body is being delocated or dislocated, but that the experience of being human is ritualized in a world of play, which is entirely exploration of the architecture of being itself. And this is the fundamental cosmological principle at work, which is being actually in many ways terraformed by a false human culture, which is a fear of death, into a political subject, which has beliefs, which has orientations, which has become stultified and it has become itself sediment of history in terms of the ritual dulling of sensation and the performance of the practice of a profound inferiority, which is the stepping down out of and from consciousness itself as a primary, direct, immediate experience of being into this ritualized political human subject of history, which is inoculated and inoculated with a fear of death or a political nationhood and all of these identity constructs, which themselves have absolutely nothing to do with play other than the forgetting of the play and the absorption in this subjective quality of the construction of the actor in response to and reaction to historical material circumstances of the world. So this is an attempt to achieve that ritual hyperspace directly back into and towards play, not just as a return to childhood, right? This is not a return to the ocean in the sense of a primordial lapsing of the human being back into the fish, so to speak. This is a hyperspace drive forward of consciousness devoting this adult or mature state of being, which is the psychologically and physically maturing organism, the devotion of these sophisticating drives toward the aesthetic ritual quality, which is the theater. The theater itself, which is the bridge, as Nietzsche would say, between man and God. Which is to say, quite simply, the sedimentary, biochemical, genetic organism of the human being as a historical artifact, leaping forward in terms of a hyperspace, in terms of a faith even, as Kierkegaard would put it, into the essential. And this is all happening right at this hinge at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s. And there are many factors that are at play here. Industrialization, hyper-technologization. And this is something that is exponentially growing over the span of the 100 years that would come after this period, after this hinge period of the Beaux Arts, after this hinge period of Oscar Wilde and Charles Baudelaire. You have Walter Benjamin as the 1900s began to mature, looking back at Baudelaire, looking back at metropolitan France, and inquiring what is happening here. Because it's a hyperspace that is occurring, that baseball is capturing through the solidification of baseball, moving from the subconscious realm, which is the realm of mud and sticks, to assemble this Frankenstein as in a representation of the human being, the essential consciousness cultural drive of the human being, a representation of that life force instinct. That is itself the emergence and the theater, the vision of the psychological change in consciousness that is occurring at a species level, but also at a semi-local level in terms of American civilization, of the convergence of this technological tectonic architecture that is coming into being, which is the utilization of precious metals to create computational devices, which are flickering millisecond-based pixel changes, which are emerging objects and images of perceived profound value as they relate to the interfacing between the visionary object and the human being who is envisioning. And this is all a movement profoundly away from the animal into the essential architecture of consciousness itself and being itself. And this is a death. Right? This is the experience of the death of the organism in real time as a consciousness artifact, a cultural consciousness artifact of history, of being in time hyper accelerating through technology, which is radically dislocating the organism from itself. And this is what we observe in so much of the political and existential conflict of the modern day in the year 2025. Because we're witnessing the hyperdrive of technology, which is emerging a radical new consciousness, which is incompatible in many, if not all ways, with the now historically outmoded version of the ritual consciousness of the human being. The human being cannot evolve fast enough because the human being is a glacial evolution, which is a natural process. But the ritual hyperspace of technology is advancing in a way that is outside of the bounds of the human being. Because it's a ritual architecture which is not dependent on nature. So you're watching this spiral. The movement of modernity is out of control. And you can understand this first and foremost as and in the schizophrenic split between the loss of the subject, as in the loss of the body as an organizing mode of consciousness, into the grand cosmic and cosmological neural network of the information and information technology systems which emerge from the collapsing of space-time. Plane, car, light bulb, quantum computing, personal digital devices, artificial intelligence. This is a radical condensation of space-time into profound forms of singularity of consciousness, which are ritualizing the emergence of the aesthetic object of modernity, which is the essence of consciousness, out from historical materialism and out from historical material history, which is a collapsing and a folding in of history and material, as in material reality, which is the construct and undergirding of the human experience. It's the Newtonian, into the revelation of the aesthetic device of all of history and all of time, which is itself an apocalypse. So that's what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.